Welcome to the Deep Dive, brought to you by Reformed Thinking.
It's good to be here.
Today, we're doing a systematic examination of communication, of architecture, and the intentional design we see behind Scripture. Our mission is pretty direct today. We want to give you a genuine shortcut to understanding one of the Bible's most common and I think maybe most misunderstood literary forms.
And that is biblical poetry.
Biblical poetry.
When we approach Scripture, our conviction is that God's communication is ordered. It's precise.
Right.
And so today, we're focused on decoding the systematic architecture that underpins this poetry.
And we really need to get a handle on the scale of this. We're not talking about some small, obscure genre.
No, not at all. This form makes up about 1/3 of the entire Bible. It's huge.
A third? That's massive.
You find it everywhere. I mean, you have the entire books of Psalms, Job, and Proverbs, of course.
The obvious ones.
The obvious ones. But it's also tucked into the historical narratives, and it really forms the backbone of the prophetic oracles.
So if you try to read that third of the Bible, from Isaiah to the Psalms, as if it were all just straightforward story or instructional prose,
you're going to miss a huge amount of the message.
And critically, you're going to miss the feeling the text is meant to produce in you.
That is the real danger. Failure to recognize these literary conventions, it risks, as our sources put it, depoeticizing its form.
Depoeticizing. I like that. You flatten it out.
You do. The Bible is an effective book. It communicates meaning not just to our intellect, but it actively moves the feelings and the will of its readers.
Okay.
So our goal here is to pull back the curtain a bit and uncover the precise mechanics, the structure, the sound, the figurative language that let the biblical poets achieve this emotional and spiritual motion in you, the reader.
So to do that, our source stack gives us a systematic analysis of pretty much everything, from the tiniest poetic units all the way up to these huge structural patterns.
Right. And then it gives us a disciplined 4-step method for accurate interpretation at the end.
So we're kind of moving from the microscopic to the macroscopic?
We are. We're starting with the foundational line units, then moving to the complex rules of parallelism, then through the larger architecture like chiasms, and finally, we'll get to the figures of speech that give poetry its stunning sensory impact.
We want you to walk away from this able to see what the poet is doing on the page, line by line, structure by structure.
That's the goal.
Okay, so let's unpack that foundational point, the structural difference. When we hear poetry, a lot of us immediately think of rhyme, or maybe a really consistent rhythm. But in the Hebrew Bible, how does it actually fundamentally differ from prose?
It's a great question, because structurally, they really are on opposite ends of a literary continuum.
Okay.
And that difference begins with the most basic unit of composition.
Which is?
In biblical prose, the text is organized mainly by the sentence and the paragraph.
Standard stuff.
Right. The syntax can be very complicated, lots of clauses. Yeah. But in biblical poetry, the dominant unit of organization is the single line.
Just the line itself.
Yes. Scholars have a technical name for it. They call it a stich.
A stich. So that single self-contained line is the core building block. That's a huge shift from prose, where one idea might sprawl across several lines connected by all sorts of conjunctions.
It is a massive shift. The whole structure of poetry is made up of these tightly arranged lines, and it shows a much higher degree of organization and internal symmetry than you'd ever find in prose.
And that architectural choice, that must have consequences for the language itself.
It forces the poet toward the second major distinction, which is just the sheer economy of language.
Linguistic economy and compression. This is where you get that intensity, that density that forces you to read more slowly.
Poetry is by its nature on the intense, dense, and compact side of things. It's defined by terseness.
Terseness.
And a real verbal inventiveness. The rhythmic structure of a poetic line basically mandates an economy of language.
Which means no wasted words.
There are absolutely no wasted words. Every single word has to be meticulously chosen, it has to be precise, and it has to fit the organizational scheme.
So if a word is on the page, it is doing some heavy lifting.
It has to be.
And that terseness, that must create some real grammatical consequences. It forces shortcuts that prose just doesn't need to use.
It does. The grammar in poetry, for instance, typically uses very concise, simple sentences. Compare that to the complex sentences with all the subordinate clauses you see in, say, Paul's letters.
Right.
And even more critically, poetry often uses a technique called ellipsis.
Ellipsis. Okay, so that's the omission of words. Can we walk through an example of that? Because this seems to define the efficiency of the stitch you mentioned.
Sure. Ellipsis is just leaving out an element, like a verb or a subject, that is assumed or implied from the line right before it.
Okay.
So think of a simple poetic couplet like, the deer seeks the swift stream, the doe, the cool shade.
Okay, the doe, the cool shade.
In that second line, the poet leaves out the verb seeks. It's omitted because you, the reader, can easily understand it from the first line. You automatically fill in the blank. The doe seeks the cool shade.
So that omission lets the poet keep the lines a similar length to maintain that rhythm while still getting a complete thought across. It makes the whole thing feel sparser, more forceful.
Precisely. It's a necessary tool for maintaining that terseness we talked about.
Whereas prose is full of those little connecting words.
Exactly. Prose uses all those prose particles, the ands, buts, fors, that poetry often just cuts out entirely. This structural scarcity, this tightness, is itself a defining feature of the poetic form.
Now, you mentioned rhythm earlier. You said that unlike a lot of English poetry, Hebrew poetry doesn't follow a strict sing-songy meter like, iambic pentameter.
Correct. It sticks to what we'd call a free variable rhythm.
But it's not chaotic.
No, not at all. It's very systematic. It's the product of two main structural elements. First, there's the end-of-line pause.
Okay.
That pause signals the completion of a thought unit, and that dictates the flow of the reading. And second, and way more significantly, the rhythm is governed by the key structural element we're about to turn to, which is parallelism.
So the rhythm comes from the line breaks and the relationship between the lines.
Yes, the line lengths do tend toward a certain symmetry, but the exact number of syllables or accents can change, which gives the poet a lot of flexibility. And that flexible rhythm is central to the feel and the tempo of the text.
Okay, so if the stitch is the basic building block, then parallelism is the mortar holding the whole structure together. It's what allows those terse lines to interact with each other.
It is.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because we have to get past this common misunderstanding that parallelism is just saying the same thing twice.
That is the single biggest hurdle to reading biblical poetry correctly. The idea that it's just repetition.
It's so much more dynamic than that.
It is. Parallelism is defined as the phenomenon where two or more successive poetic lines dynamically strengthen, reinforce, and, crucially, develop each other's thought. It has this kind of double logic, where it's using both similarity and progression at the same time.
I really like the analogy, the source's use of binocular vision.
It's a perfect analogy, isn't it?
It is.
Parallelism superimposes two slightly different views of the same object, line A and line B, and when they converge, it produces a sense of depth and, most of all, progression in the message.
So the thought is always moving forward.
Always. The movement from that first line to the second is one of active heightening or intensification or focusing or specification.
Or concretization, dramatization.
All of those. The thought is constantly being advanced, kind of like climbing a ladder, taking the reader toward a deeper insight.
So to properly interpret this progression, we need a better system than the old labels. We need a functional taxonomy.
Absolutely. We're going to use a systematic approach here to categorize the relationship between that first stitch, which we'll call A, and the next one, which we'll call B. We're going to focus on exactly how B functions in relation to A.
Okay, so let's start with the first variation.
The first category is where lines A and B are, in some way, interchangeable. They're semantically similar. But B either echoes or contrasts A.
And the echo part is what we used to call synonymous parallelism.
That's right. Echo, or synonymous parallelism, is when B restates the point of A in different words.
Yeah.
Now, it shows very little perceptible development, but it adds a lot of rhetorical force.
Okay, so it might look like repetition, but it's doing something.
It is. Take Matthew 11:30. My yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Right. Those lines look very, very similar.
They do. They look highly synonymous.
Yeah.
But if you look a little closer, the second line, using the word light, it specifies why the yoke is easy. It gives you the specific quality that makes the demand gentle.
So light is a specification of easy. It's not just a fancy way of saying the same thing.
Right. It specifies the nature of that ease. And the repetition itself acts as rhetorical emphasis. It's a double affirmation. It makes the idea stick.
So it adds this rhetorical momentum, kind of cementing the idea in your mind. Okay. And the other side of this first category is contrast.
Also called antithetical parallelism. Here, B signals a contrast to A, often expressing total opposites.
And you see this all over the wisdom literature.
All over Proverbs, yes. It's used to establish very clear moral and spiritual boundaries. Proverbs 11.20 contrasts God's reaction to two kinds of hearts.
Okay.
The first line says, "The Lord hates those who are crooked in heart."
A very strong statement.
A very strong negative. But the second line says, "He is pleased with those whose way is blameless." The lines are syntactically parallel, but they communicate opposing ideas.
So it serves as both a warning to the wicked and an assurance to the righteous in one compact package. The progression is from negative to positive.
It is. The thought moves from consequence A to consequence B.
All right, let's move to the second major variation. Here, the relationship is A is greater than B. So A states the main idea, and B qualifies it further. It kind of functions like a subordinate clause.
Yes, B specifies or gives details about the claim made in A. This is sometimes called parallelism of subordination, because that second line is serving a subordinate role to the first.
And its function is often to specify the means by which something happened, or the reason why, or the time.
Let's look at Exodus 15.21 again. "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted."
Okay.
The main statement, the command, is in line A, "Sing to the Lord."
Right.
But line B qualifies that command by giving the reason for it, for he is highly exalted.
So to read that correctly, you have to follow that logic. The command to worship is grounded directly on that reason.
It is. The second line grounds the first.
Okay.
Or another example, Psalm 111.6. It says that God showed his power. That's line A.
God showed his power.
Then line B tells you how. By giving his people the heritage of the nations. B explains the means by which A was accomplished. The progression is always moving toward greater detail or justification.
Okay, so now we flip that dynamic for the third variation. Now, B is greater than A.
Right.
A prefaces the idea, and B states the main idea by either complementing or completing. This shows a really critical progression of thought.
This is where a lot of the intensification and focusing happens. The second line acts like an expansion or an elaboration of the opening thought. It's where the poet often puts the climax.
Let's start with comparison, which use simile or metaphor.
Okay, in this subtype, B explains an abstract idea in A by comparing it to something concrete.
Like Psalm 103.13.
A perfect example. "As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him."
So the first line is the well-known, accessible reality of a father's compassion.
The human reference point that we can all grasp. And it's used to help us understand the unknown reality of the Lord's compassion. The progression is from the human example to the divine truth. It gives form and feeling to an otherwise abstract concept.
Okay, and then there's specification, which is about changing the reader's focus.
With specification, the movement is from the general to the specific. The poet starts out broad and then dramatically narrows the focus.
Like in Isaiah 45.1.
Exactly. Line A states, very generally, "I made the earth."
A huge cosmic statement of creation.
A massive statement. But then line B immediately specifies "and created humankind upon it." The general statement about the whole planet is instantly narrowed to focus your attention on humanity within that creation.
So the overall statement is about God's sovereignty, but the progression reveals his specific interest in humanity.
It does. It directs your focus.
And finally, under this category, we have intensification.
This is where B restates A, but in a much more pointed, extreme, or forceful way. It's like the poet is saying, and not only that, but even more so.
Proverbs 3.7 gives us a perfect example of this.
It does. Line A says, "Your granaries will be filled with abundance."
Which is a very positive outcome, a blessing.
A good thing. But then line B intensifies it with hyperbole, saying, "And with new wine, your vats will burst."
So it goes from the passive state of being filled to this dramatic, explosive action of vats bursting.
It escalates it. It's an exaggeration that underscores the overwhelming, over-the-top nature of God's provision. The logic here is not repetition at all. It's a rhetorical ladder that leads you to a climax, and it makes sure you feel the magnitude of the blessing.
Okay, so let's zoom out. We've gone from the line-by-line flow. Now let's look at how biblical poets organize whole passages, sometimes even entire books, using these vast structural patterns.
These are the macro architecture devices.
And what are they? How do they define these larger units of meaning?
Well, these devices impose a large-scale architecture on the text. And if you can recognize them, it allows you to identify the major subdivisions, the sense units, of an entire poem.
Which in turn guides your interpretation of the author's argument.
That's the key.
Let's start with chiasm.
Chiasm is a rhetorical device that uses a reverse word order in parallel lines. It creates a pattern of A, B, and then B prime, A prime.
Like an X.
Exactly. It gets its name from the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X, because of that crossing pattern.
Now, in short little couplets, it can underscore a contrast or show a reversal of fate. But what about the extended chiasm? How does that work in large passages?
This is maybe the most useful structural tool for finding the central message of a longer passage. In a large chiasm, the main point, the climax of the whole section, falls in the structural center.
The structural hinge.
Yes. It's the one section that doesn't have a parallel counterpart. And the secondary points are in the frames, the corresponding sections at the beginning and the end. If you can find that center, you have found the poet's main theological focus.
Okay, let's really spend some time on this case study from Jeremiah 2. It's a perfect demonstration of how this structure reveals theological priority.
It really is. In this extended chiasm, Jeremiah is condemning Israel's actions. The structure is built very carefully. The A and A prime sections, the outer frames, condemn all of Israel, the fathers and the grandchildren, for following worthless idols.
Okay, so the whole nation is framed by this condemnation.
Right. Then the B section accuses them of asking, "Where's the Lord?" And the B prime section accuses them of saying, "We will not come to you again." Then the C section condemns the priests, and C prime condemns the prophets.
So all of these surrounding parts, the A, B, C, D sections and their counterparts, they are all focused on the people's failure.
The people's failure, the leader's complicity.
Yeah.
But the structural hinge, the central point, which is labeled E in the analysis, it states this: "I brought you to an orchard land to eat its lovely fruit."
Wow. The power of the structure here is that if you were just reading this as prose, you might see that statement about God's provision as just one more historical fact in a list.
Just another detail.
But when the poet puts it in the dead center of the chiasm, it elevates that single idea, God's initial faithful provision, above all the condemnations surrounding it.
That is the interpretive payoff. The central message isn't just that Israel sinned, it's that their sin was an egregious response to God's prior and unmatched generosity.
So the whole indictment hinges on the fact that Yahweh was faithful, he put them in paradise, and they were the ones who failed.
Right. Analyzing the chiasm isolates the central argument of God's provision and faithfulness, and that then serves as the standard by which all the surrounding condemnations are to be judged. It's a brilliant piece of literary architecture.
Okay, next up we have merismus,
Merismus.
which uses the extremes of a category to define the whole scope.
Merismus is a rhetorical device where the writer mentions the extremes of a category to portray the totality, those two opposites and everything that falls in between them.
And it's used to achieve this really comprehensive, all-encompassing effect.
It is. This is a very common device.
And this concept seems incredibly important because it often speaks to the comprehensiveness of God's domain.
It does. The classic example of totality is Genesis 1:1.
Yeah.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
The heavens and the earth.
That merismus uses the extremes of the created order, heavens and earth, to affirm that God created the entirety of the universe and everything in it. If it's not heaven, it's earth. And God made both. It leaves nothing out.
And we see this used with categories of people as well.
Very often. Jeremiah 31:34, speaking of the new covenant, says that everyone will know the Lord from the least of them to the greatest.
Right, from the bottom to the top.
It uses the extremes of social status, least and greatest, to mean everyone, the whole category of people. It's a totalizing statement about inclusion in the covenant.
And the sources also bring up a double merismus. What's that?
Psalm 95.4-5 uses two distinct pairs of extremes to affirm God's absolute ownership over the whole earth.
Okay, two pairs.
The first pair describes the vertical extremes, the depths of the earth and the mountain peaks.
So high low.
And the second pair describes the horizontal extremes, the sea and the dry land.
Okay, wet and dry.
By combining those four elements, the poet creates this inescapable affirmation that God owns every single dimension of the planet. There's nowhere you can go that isn't his.
Okay, finally, let's look at the structural devices of inclusio and staircase parallelism.
Inclusio is basically a framing device. It involves repeating words or phrases from the opening lines at the very end of a poem or a section.
And its function is to signal the poem's main theme. It provides unity. It's like drawing a conceptual box around the main argument.
That's a great way to put it. For example, Psalm 8 opens and closes with the exact same line. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth.
Right.
That inclusio confirms that everything discussed in the middle of the song, the majesty of the stars, humanity's delegated rule over creation, is all just an elaboration of that one single theme, God's majesty displayed on earth. It forces you to return to the core idea at the end.
And then we have staircase parallelism. This seems related to the idea of intensification we talked about earlier.
It is. Staircase parallelism develops the lines in steps. It adds new elements or key words that build on the previous line, creating this verbal chain that leads to a climax in the last line.
So the thought progresses like climbing stairs.
Exactly. You see this in John 1.4 to 5. The thought begins with life. That's the first step. Then the concept of life is connected to light in the next step.
Life was the light of men.
Right. And then light is connected to the struggle with darkness in the final step. It creates a steady progression where the concluding element finishes the thought with maximum impact. Okay, so if the structures we've just discussed are the skeleton, the architecture of the poem, then imagery is the flesh and blood.
This is what makes it feel alive.
It is. Poetry uses a very high concentration of metaphors and images. It substitutes abstract ideas with concrete words.
And why is that?
Because poetry is designed to appeal more to the reader's imagination and senses than to just cold reason. It allows you to experience the topic, to feel its weight, to see its reality, to smell its truth.
All right, let's start with two of the most common devices, simile and metaphor. We need to be really precise about the functional difference between them because they are so often confused.
The distinction is all about whether the comparison is explicit or implicit, and that choice changes their rhetorical function.
Okay, so simile is the explicit comparison.
A simile compares two things using the signal words like or as. That explicit signal gently guides the reader from something they know well to something they don't know, making the abstract concept easier to digest. We saw this already in Psalm 103, comparing the Lord's compassion to a father's using as. The comparison is gentle, it's educational.
And by contrast, metaphor is the implicit comparison.
A metaphor compares two things bluntly by just stating that A is B. It gets rid of the like or as. For example, the Lord is a rock.
It asserts an identity.
It does. It makes this direct striking connection between two things that are basically dissimilar, God and a geological formation that happen to share a crucial trait.
And in that case, it's unchanging strength.
Right. And the metaphor creates a much more striking effect because the reader has to immediately bridge that conceptual gap themselves without being handed a signal word.
It forces you to participate in creating the image more forcefully, like that vivid image of Jerusalem's officials being called roaring lions. It's a striking equation of their greedy, predatory behavior with the physical strength and hunger of a wild animal.
A much more powerful image than saying they are like roaring lions.
Okay, next we have hyperbole, a really crucial device for conveying intense feeling.
It is.
Which is conscious exaggeration for the sake of effect. It's stretching literal truth to create an emotional impact.
And its purpose is to state something the poet feels very strongly, whether that's joy or suffering or divine judgment. It forces the reader to share in that intense feeling.
Let's use the example of distress from Psalm 22.14. It's incredibly powerful.
The psalmist writes, "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint."
Which literally is impossible.
Of course, but the exaggeration conveys complete, devastating exhaustion. Yeah. It's the feeling of, I've got no fight left in me. It serves as a dramatic expression of deep distress, not a literal medical report. The device helps us access the depth of the poet's suffering.
And we really have to consider the most striking example of hyperbolic frustration, and that's Paul's comment in Galatians 5.1. He's so frustrated with the legalistic agitators that he says, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves.
That is, without a doubt, an expression of maximum rhetorical frustration.
It's shocking.
It's meant to be. It's a classic use of conscious exaggeration to communicate the intensity of his feeling about the danger these agitators posed to the gospel of grace. It's a dramatic exclamation designed to shock his readers into seeing how serious the issue is. It should never, ever be read as a literal command.
Its function is purely rhetorical emphasis of the highest order.
Of the highest order, yes.
Okay, how do poets make abstract ideas relatable and generate a sense of excitement?
Two devices are key here, personification and apostrophe.
Let's start with personification.
Personification is when a non-human subject, an inanimate object or an abstract idea, is written about as if it were human.
Giving it a sense of agency.
Exactly. It makes the subject vivid and concrete for the reader. In Psalm 43.3, the poet asks God to, "Send me your light and your faithful care, let them guide me."
So light and care become guides.
The abstract concepts of light and care are portrayed as people, as guides. leading him directly to the temple. This instantly makes these ideas relatable in personal, active terms. You see this all over, like in Proverbs 8, where wisdom is pictured as a woman calling out in the streets.
And then there's apostrophe, which can be really startling when it appears.
Apostrophe is a direct address to someone or something that is absent as though it were present. And it usually appears very suddenly. It often signals that the poet has been overcome by emotion and is just venting.
So its main function is to give vent to strong feelings and generate a sense of excitement and drama.
Yes. Paul uses this with such power when he addresses death directly in 1 Corinthians 15.
Where, O death, is your victory?
Where, O death, is your sting? This sudden direct challenge to death itself generates this intense excitement, and it affirms the profound hope of the resurrection. It's an address that turns an abstract victory into a personal, dramatic confrontation.
All right, the final pair of devices we need to distinguish are metonymy and synecdoche. Both involve substitution, but they work a little differently.
They do. Let's start with metonymy. This is the substitution of a word or idea for one that is closely associated with it. The substitute is a verbal stand-in for the real concept.
The example at the table is really clear here.
In Psalm 23.5, it says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." The word table stands in for the bountiful meal that's prepared on it.
Right. The point isn't the piece of furniture.
The point is the extravagant provision of food, the feasting that God gives the psalmist, even while his enemies are watching, probably hoping he starves. The table is closely associated with the meal.
Okay. And synecdoche?
Synecdoche happens when a part of something is used to represent the whole idea or item. And this device is particularly good for focusing the reader's attention on one key detail that carries the thematic weight of the statement.
So the goal here is focus, thematic contrast.
Think about Amos 8:10, where God declares, "I will turn your religious festivals into mourning and all your singing into weeping."
Okay, singing.
Singing is only one part of the religious festivals, which are the whole. But the poet chooses singing specifically because it symbolizes joy and celebration. By substituting the part for the whole, the poet focuses your attention on the specific joy that is about to be replaced by mourning and weeping when judgment falls.
Okay, let's move now to the auditory elements. Even when we're reading in translation, the sound and the rhythm are being used deliberately to signal the poet's intentions, to cast a spotlight on key words.
The structure governs the thought, but the sound governs the focus and the tempo.
So let's talk about rhythm and tempo.
As we mentioned, Hebrew poetry has a variable rhythm. But a good literal English translation can often reveal the relative lengths of the poetic lines, and that length indicates the poem's intended tempo, or its speed.
So line length is a crucial tempo indicator.
It really is. Short, compact lines suggest a kind of staccato rapidity, quick action, a sense of urgency.
In long lines.
Long lines convey slowness. They often direct the reader to dwell on the solemnity or the gravity of a thought.
And a sudden shift in that length that acts as a kind of poetic special effect.
It does. A sudden, surprising change in line length alters the tempo, and it compels you to pay special attention to those lines. It's a signal that a crucial piece of information is being delivered.
The case study from Nahum 3 is the quintessential demonstration of how this works, how tempo highlights the reason for judgment.
It's a perfect example. Nahum's description of Nineveh's military downfall is delivered with a series of very short, compact, rapid-fire lines.
Like panels.
The crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, charging cavalry, flashing swords, and glittering spears. It creates this vivid, chaotic sense of rapid, destructive action. The speed of the lines mirrors the violence of the scene.
And then the sudden shift, the sudden stop.
That frantic staccato action just halts, and is followed by two much longer, drawn-out concluding lines that state the reason for all that chaos. All because of the wanton lust of a prostitute, who enslaved nations by her prostitution and peoples by her witchcraft. The abrupt stop in tempo dramatically shifts your focus away from the action of the collapse and puts it entirely onto the moral cause of the collapse. Nineveh's profound corruption. The structural change is a powerful rhetorical punctuation mark.
Okay, so beyond tempo, poets use the actual sounds of the words, the vowels and consonants, to create cohesion and emphasis.
Yes, assonance and alliteration.
Let's define assonance first.
Assonance is the repetition of similar vowel sounds. Its purpose is twofold. First, to give a feeling of unity to a poetic unit, and second, to provide special emphasis to certain words by linking sound with sense.
And alliteration is the same idea, but with consonants.
Right. Alliteration is the repetition of similar consonant sounds. It likewise provides a sense of wholeness and gives special emphasis to key words. If a theme word is dominant in a poem, you'll often find alliteration surrounding that word to highlight it and make it acoustically memorable.
It's got to be notoriously difficult to capture the full effect of these devices in translation.
It is, very much so. The Hebrew poets were master craftsmen. They were choosing words for their sound just as much as for their meaning. We rarely experience the full sonic force in English.
But it's good to know it's there.
It is. Recognizing that assonance and alliteration exist helps us understand why certain phrases feel so cohesive or memorable, even after translation. They signal the poet's deliberate intentions, and they enhance memorability.
And finally, under sound, we have wordplay.
Wordplay, also called paranomasia, or just puns, is the clever use of similar-sounding words to call special attention to them, even if they seem unrelated at first.
This definitely requires some knowledge of the original language, but it's vital when you're studying the text closely.
The function can be really significant. Wordplay can underscore the poem's central theme, or it can highlight a strategic contrast between two different concepts.
Let's use that specific example from Jeremiah 1.
Okay. Jeremiah tells God, "I see a branch of an almond tree." The Hebrew word for almond tree is shaked.
Shoked?
And Yahweh's reply immediately picks up on that root sound to create a verbal link. He says, "I am watching." And the Hebrew word there is shoked, to see that my word is fulfilled.
Shoked and shoved.
The wordplay links the image of the almond tree, which is the first tree to bud in the spring, with God's promise to actively fulfill his word. The poet is using sound to reinforce the theme of God's vigilance and timeliness in carrying out his decree. So, given all these interlocking structures and devices, the parallelism, the imagery, the sound play, it becomes clear that a systematic approach is necessary. We needed to ensure we're extracting the intended meaning and avoiding misreading or overinterpretation.
Right.
So this discipline method consists of 4 critical steps for handling the figurative language that is so common in biblical poetry.
And this systematic approach is essential because we recognize that this poetry communicates by moving our feelings and our will, and so we need a kind of filter to properly discern the poet's intent from just our own imagination.
That's a good way to put it. Okay, step 1.
Step 1.
Identify the figure or figures of speech present. The first step is simple recognition. You have to identify the specific device being used. Is it a simile, a metaphor, personification, hyperbole? And you have to note that complex passages can often contain combinations of these. You might find hyperbole expressed through a metaphor, all within a structure of intensification.
Okay, so first, just name what you're seeing. Then step 2.
Step 2. Identify its emotional connotations. We have to determine the emotional associations, both positive and negative, that the original reader would have connected with the literal object being used.
So what did it mean to them?
Right. For example, concepts like rock, fortress, shield, stronghold. Those generally connote positive, established ideas of strength, protection, salvation.
But some words are more ambiguous.
They are. Words like shadow or water can carry both positive connotations like shade or life-giving water and negative ones like gloom or judgment. And we have to weigh that against the specific context.
Okay, that brings us to step 3, which seems to be the most critical step.
It is. Step 3. Distill the figurative meaning from the literal one. This is the step that guards against misreading. You have to recognize the literal object. What does it do in the physical world? And then determine the specific, restricted aspect of that literal meaning that the poet wants to highlight in this immediate context.
Let's spend some time on this case study. Slander as spears and arrows. This seems like a perfect illustration of how to restrict the interpretation.
Okay. In Psalm 57.4, the psalmist says his enemies have teeth that are spears and arrows whose tongues are sharp swords.
A vivid image.
Very. We start with the literal meaning. What do spears and arrows actually do?
Well, they strike from a distance, they inflict painful, deep wounds, and they often catch the victim by surprise, defenseless.
Right. Those are the physical ideas these weapons conjure up.
And we have to stick to just those points of comparison. The poet isn't interested in what kind of wood they were made from or who manufactured them.
Exactly. So therefore, the figurative meaning illuminates slander as harsh, pointed words that wound their victims suddenly and defenselessly. The words imply secrecy, pain, distance. The point is not that the enemies literally have teeth like weapons. The point is that their words function like those weapons. You have to restrict the comparison to only the traits they share.
And this brings us right to the guard against overinterpretation.
This rule is paramount. We must adhere strictly to the rule of context, both the literary context and the historical cultural context. Images usually invoke only a few points of comparison, maybe just one or two out of a huge range of possibilities.
So our interpretation has to be limited strictly to that restricted range.
Or else we risk aesthesis, reading in meanings that were never intended. We had to ask what these terms connoted in biblical times. A horn, for instance, only connoted strength or dignity in the ancient Near East. It had nothing to do with the musical instrument. We have to limit our interpretation to what the original audience would have understood.
Okay, and that leads us to the final step, step 4.
Step 4. Determine the figure's function. Why was it used here? You have to ascertain what the figure contributed to the overall meaning or theme of the passage. Why did the poet choose this specific image instead of just a plainer statement?
The example from Psalm 18.2 illustrates how figurative language can establish the entire argument of a passage.
It does. Psalm 18.2 uses metaphors like rock, fortress, and shield to describe God. Their function is not just decorative. They are carefully chosen to establish the psalm's main theme: God's absolute awesome strength and protection in the face of violent opposition. The consistent use of military and geological imagery contributes directly to the thematic statement the poet wanted to make about God's reliability as a savior.
So after all of this, what does this systematic approach mean for you as you sit down to read your Bible?
Well,
It means reading 1/3 of the scripture with fresh eyes. The structure, especially dynamic parallelism, is what guides the progression of thought. It ensures the idea is always being intensified or specified, never just repeated.
and the imagery, the metaphors, and similes, that's what gives the idea flesh and blood. It allows you to experience the topic emotionally.
And the sound play, though it can be subtle in translation, adds that layer of emphasis and memorability.
Biblical poetry is designed by a precise communicator. It's meant to engage not just your understanding, but your senses and your feelings, to move your will toward action or toward worship. By honoring its complex architecture and systematic language, we are just better equipped to understand the message God intends to communicate.
It's a disciplined approach.
It is, and it helps us avoid missing the subtlety, the depth, and the emotional resonance that is intentionally built into this unique literary form.
And remember, the reading rate for poetry is inherently slow. It has to be because of its density. Its structural sparseness demands your full attention. So consider this. Maybe deliberately slowing your reading pace through the Psalms or the Prophets isn't just a devotional practice. Maybe it's a prerequisite for grasping the poet's intended tempo and focus, revealing layer upon layer of truth that just fast reading is bound to obscure. Now, there is something to chew on.